Hello everyone, so welcome to this really interesting conversation I'm going to be having with Abu-Bakr. My name is Mymuna Soleman. I'm of Somali origin, but I was born and bred in Wales, in Cardiff. I did both my degrees at Cardiff Met, so I've got an undergrad in health and social care, and I did my master's in public health. So I'm really passionate about public health related issues, but I'm also very keen and passionate about issues around representation, equality and diversity, race, and white privilege in particular, and how that can impact so many different parts of our lives. But yeah, so in terms of where Privilege Cafe has come from, Privilege Cafe was born on the back of frustration, if I'm really honest, and boredom as well. I didn't have a job at the time, but yeah, on the back of frustration and lots of white Zooms I was on constantly. I'm very much a people's person, so I love going to events and talking to people and having my voice heard and not representing people that look like me, but representing myself and giving a voice for women who look like me and sound like me or have a similar name. So yeah, I was just really frustrated on all these white Zooms I was on. I really didn't have. I felt like my voice wasn't listened to or heard enough, and I wasn't given, I guess, a space. And I just wanted to just flip that on its head and flip the narrative and basically just create my own safe space. Yeah, I didn't even have a Zoom account to begin with, if I'm all honest with you. I just really wanted to delve into this question of what it meant for me to express myself in a room filled with privilege, which was my first sort of discussion back in April last year, just as we got into lockdown. And I guess from that conversation, 55 people turned up, and I was really taken aback because I wasn't really sure how it would sort of like turn out. And I guess I have to also be honest about my own biases as well, because I was thinking, oh, there's lots of people signed up. Are they really interested? Will they really listen to me? And I guess that one conversation, then the Privilege Cafe just grew from there. And I genuinely didn't call it the White Privilege Cafe on purpose, because I know nobody would turn up. So I had to be really mindful of what I wanted to call it in order to get the meaningful engagement that I really wanted. And yeah, it just really grew from there. And I think I've done around 40 sessions with some amazing contributors, including Abu-Bakr and so many other like-minded people, and lots of topics around the justice system, education, recruitment. I mean, language and linguistics. There's just, the topics have just been so broad, but really easy for me to, I guess, to name, because I've lived most of the topics and the themes through lived experience, or I'm really passionate about them. And yeah, it's really, for me, been a huge catalyst for change, especially through the feedback that I've had. And it's definitely been more than just a Zoom discussion, in terms of impacting policy and strategy and social change in general. So I'm really happy with the way things have gone and how it's really grew from there. So yeah, I feel like the Privilege Cafe is definitely not your usual way of working. There's no sort of structure. I mean, lots of people would even reach out to me and say, Mymuna, what's the itinerary? What's the agenda? What's the framework? What's your approach to engagement, Mymuna? And how are you doing this? And I'm like, well, I really don't tick any of those boxes. It's about being authentic. And, there is no itinerary, there is no agenda. It's a safe, open space for people to come and learn and grow and just really share their lived experiences, and for people who are privileged to come and use their privilege for good, really. But yeah, I think for me, definitely my highlight for me, just if I can say that quickly now and maybe discuss it later, was the Welshness and whiteness session, where that was my most well-attended session, with over like 340 people attended. And it was just a really good open discussion about what whiteness meant and what Welshness meant and identity, and how I guess those conversations about identity and belonging can really filter through to so many aspects of our lives, and working lives and personal lives, and even public services and how we engage and interact with people. So yeah, I mean, Privilege Cafe is ongoing and it's constantly growing and changing. But yeah, ultimately it's a safe, open space. It's a virtual space. Hopefully I want to open an actual space at some point, but yeah, it really has grew immensely. And Abu-Bakr has been a huge anchor and played a big role in the shaping of the cafe and the content and the knowledge and wisdom he's shared. And I'm really glad he's part of this conversation today. And I think I'll pass it over to him to give his introduction. I probably wouldn't give it the credit it deserves. So I'll pass it over to you, Abu-Bakr.
Okay, thank you, Mymuna. Thanks, everybody. My name is Abu-Bakr Madden Al-Shabazz. I'm of Jamaican descent. I'm also a Maroon, which means that we were a people which came from Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain, during the time of Columbus. We were forced to settle in the Caribbean islands. We went to the mountain tops, etc., and we fought against the Spanish the British, the French, all these different colonial powers that came into the Caribbean to occupy them in order to enslave us, which was pretty hard to do. We won our victories with the British around about 1737, 1738, even though we had partial independence on Jamaica. You know, the fact of the matter is there was a proudness amongst the Jamaican people. And I think that is what was transferred to me in order to become a historian. My grandmother was from the Maroon people. Even though she couldn't read or write, she taught me as much things as she can within the first 7 or 8 years before her death. I feel blessed in a sense because my grandmother, she was born in the latter part of the 1800s, which most people my age couldn't actually prove. So the fact of the matter is that she was well versed in understanding, you know, the history of the Caribbean, etc. And her point of coming in the 1950s was to rebuild the so-called mother country. She worked hard, she worked as a servant, she sent for my father. My grandparents on my maternal side both came over here. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she worked as a maternity nurse for approximately 30, 35 years in this country. So I come from like that Windrush generation, etc. About me, I was educated, I was born in Barry, Vale of Glamorgan. I moved to Cardiff when I was about 18 months. I lived with my father, who was a single father. I lived in quite what would be known at that time was probably a working middle class area. We were quite upwardly mobile, quite fortunate, etc. in a sense. You know, my father bought his property. There was a lot of discrimination at the time growing up, so I didn't know until later on why wasn't I allowed to play out in the street up until I was about maybe 9 or 10 years old, you know. So, you know, I suffered a few racial incidences growing up, you know, with some of the local boys and local girls, etc., and experiences in school. Did pretty well in school up until the age of 11, and then I was put in a remedial class whereby I became more or less a teacher's assistant to help those delinquent students who couldn't read or write. So I was basically used. I had the opportunity to go to Barry College of Further Education to do 3 courses, 3 diplomas, communication skills. I also did cookery, which I specialized in French cuisine. And I also did food and beverage services. Came out with 6 diplomas actually. Went to the catering industry for approximately 22 years, you know, as an experienced qualified chef, and I made it up to an executive chef position. Suffered a lot of discrimination in the catering industry. That was one of the reasons why I left, to speak out against the racial injustice within the city. And that's what really got me into academia. So rather than be an outright activist, verbal activist, I decided I may be able to channel that form of aggression in a more positive way by teaching people and making them try to understand step by step of the reality of, you know, Black and brown people within the city of Cardiff. So that's basically something about me. Just to finalize, I went back to university. I went back into education as a mature student. Doing the access course I did for 3 years. I was still working full time. I was married. At the time I had 4 children. So it was very difficult juggling work, college and family. I went on to Cardiff University where I did a BS honors in economics. So I did things in education, sociology, anthropology, child development. And the reason why I did those courses for me to be a better person, a better father. It wasn't to get a job. And later on, I went to do my PGCE in education and special educational needs and disability. I'm now a visiting senior fellow lecturer at Cardiff University in the history department and School of Social Sciences. I also ran a Black and African History Studies course for 9 years, which was pretty successful. Started off as a community course and then went to become a degree much later on. At this moment in time, I'm a special education needs tutor and a counsellor for Caerphilly County Borough Council, where I work with students who have mental health issues, special educational needs, and disruptive behavioural disorders. And I like to go for the most challenging kids because I believe that all children can be reached, even if they're difficult or complex to work with. And this is some of the things that I like to put out there. I'm also an educational consultant for the Welsh Assembly government, looking at the new curriculum. I am a bit uncomfortable about the curriculum in Wales or in Britain generally. It omits the Black and African and the brown experiences from the curriculum, which was quite a building mechanism as far as the British Empire was concerned. So I'm working for the working group. And we're hoping to put out a report, and we're hoping for a multicultural curriculum to be established in approximately 2022. So that's it. I'm a historian by background. I'm a psychologist, a psychotherapist, an anthropologist, a sociologist. So that is my background. So that's just a little introduction about myself. Over to you, Mymuna.
Thank you, Abu-Bakr. That was really impressive, and amazing to see the wide depth of work that you're doing, and it's really interesting to hear. I just wanted to ask a question. I know we've had so many amazing discussions at the cafe. Think of some of the topics, the main topics that we've discussed that could really relate maybe to public services, and what comes to your mind when we think of public services. For example, the session that we had on green spaces and whether Black people were too urban, or the discussion that we had on man-made poverty and how the free school meal conversation. Lots of different discussions that we've had, whether the mental health services and whether the mental health services are actually making people more mentally unwell. These are just some of the topics that I'm just picking out from the discussions that we had. I'm just thinking about those themes and those topic areas. How do you think they could relate to public services and how they're being run and who they're being run for? Who's having these conversations? Are they the right people? And yeah, just what are your thoughts on some of those questions?
I think if we're looking at public spaces as an example in relation to public services, I think we need to take a historical journey. And I think if we go back to the post-war period where a lot of African Caribbeans and Africans and other groups of people came over here to rebuild the mother country, what a lot of people don't realize, there was racial segregation in this country. And in 1965, they passed the Racial Relation Act, and that was to stop the discrimination or the actual social segregation within British society, such as dance halls, cinemas, restaurants and hotels, bed and breakfasts, beaches, okay? And the list just goes on, even golf clubs, bowling clubs, etc., etc. So even though they like to focus on the United States of America, there's this sense of putting their head in the sand that they were actually practicing and institutionalized racial segregation. So even though those spaces may have opened up from 1965 onwards, there's been, I think there's been a slow process in seeing the integration in many of these public spaces as far as public services are concerned. So for example, we had to fight, there was bus strikes in many, many major cities in England and Wales, in order to allow Black people to become passengers, even though they were relegated to become bus conductors and bus drivers. So there's elements of hypocrisy where that was concerned.
Can I just interject there quickly? Do you think, can you give us some examples that we can relate to today, for example, and how public services are run, and how some of these disparities might not be so overt, but actually are still happening very much so?
I think if we look at the employment, for instance, I think in many of the public services, if we're looking at transportations, logistics, etc., I don't think there's a good, fair representation of so-called BAME communities, and that needs to increase. And what I have noticed since the George Floyd murder, I've noticed where more BAME people are being employed, maybe to do elements of security to ensure that many of the passengers who are using these public services, as far as transportation is concerned, is directed in a particular way in order to, stop the close proximity in, walking or sitting, whatever the case may be. And I've also seen an increase in the amount of so-called BAME communities, Black and brown particularly, who are now given sanitizers to clean the trains and the buses and all these other type of things. So even though they are slowly putting us into public services where transport is concerned, it's relegated to low status work. So those type of discriminatory practices are there, and it is evident. So, if we're looking at it from that perspective, we can see that there's a sense of urgency, but the sense of trying to cover up the reality of their organizations or what kind of services they're providing, and trying to push us in there in order to say, well, they're doing a good job. And I don't think they've done a good job, to tell the truth, if we're looking at those type of public services.
I think the sense of urgency is there, but it's only when it suits them. I just feel like there is this whole thing about you know, a bit of like hypocrisy, and, you know, there's a sense of urgency only when it suits them, or only when, for example, someone gets murdered. And this whole thing about public services jumping on a bandwagon and having this approach about tokenism, or just using people for marketing, and, you know, this tokenistic approach that's constantly, this tick box approach that's happening. And I feel like it's really to fit their own agenda, whether it's to tick their KPIs or whatever. But this issue about jumping on a bandwagon, I've kind of seen like a slow decrease in sort of the work being continued. And, you know, back in June, there was a lot more information, for example, being shared. And I feel like communication and being transparent in the work that you're doing. I'm talking to public services here, and lots of white-led public services and public service employees. I feel like it's definitely that bandwagon is slowed down a lot, and it's really quite telling, because, you know, it really comes into question whether the right intention was there, or whether it's disingenuous. And when I've had conversations to call people out on that disingenuous approach, for example, it hasn't gone down too well. And, you know, sometimes I just think, is it just to show face during such a tragic time when someone gets murdered, or we see someone get murdered? I mean, people get murdered all the time. We just happen to see that one. But yeah, it really just makes me think, are the right people actually leading the conversation? Do the right people have the power? Because lots of people are not willing to share their power, especially when it comes to public service. And you think that this is a public service. Are you really the public?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. If you're looking at power, whenever there is power, there's always going to be an element of privilege following, you know, behind that. And the fact of the matter is, if we're looking at public services as far as race relations is concerned within Britain, then there's a couple of factors we need to take into account. And that is that so-called Black and brown people are not in strategic positions within public services in order to make decisions. And this is the thing. So it is still a form of institutionalized colonialism, cloaked in terminologies such as equality, diversity, and all these other type of things. We live in a multicultural society and pluralism and all these other type of terminologies. But it's very much a tick box exercise when it suits them, unfortunately. And they're still in decision making, and they're still in decision-making decisions. And the thing is, why they're able to do that and perpetuate that is because they're never brought to account, okay, when they're in those positions of responsibility. I believe as an individual that responsibility comes accountability. If you screw up, whatever the case may be, you should be held accountable.
Oh, you can hold people to account, and like I've done, for example, and then you really do get shut down. And you're the troublemaker, you're the angry, aggressive Black woman. And this whole thing about, it does really come down to representation or lack of representation, especially filtering right through to the top. I remember when I worked in a position as a researcher, and then I saw myself in much more senior meetings because I was that token ethnic minority person. And I was asked, oh yeah, can you come and join this strategic meeting or this policy meeting? And I saw myself in those really powerful discussions and conversations. I just didn't have the privilege that went with it, or the benefits that went with it, which was really quite shocking. So I think every conversation that we've had through the cafe really does come down to, and it's something that I'm always pushing for, is voices, representation of voices of colour at every level. And it always comes down to that, because if I'm in an all-white team, and then, for example, I leave that job, then who's going to prioritize those issues if they're all white middle class? And are they going to keep waiting for that Black individual or that brown individual to constantly raise that question? So representation is definitely key. How do you think then organizations and public sector organizations in particular, right, those at the top, what do you think they need to do in order to change? Or is that even our job to tell them?
Well, the fact that it is our job to tell them, because, you know, you can't hold people accountable if they certainly don't know. And if we're looking at middle class individuals, male or female, who put in strategic positions, okay, within the, you know, the services or whatever the case may be, then we need to realize that they need to know from us what the problems are. And the reason is because many of them grew up in, middle-class areas. And like I've said in many presentations, they lived in neighborhoods where there was no so-called black and brown people. They were not educated in the educational system that they went through for the 16 or the 23 years by black and brown people. Their communities are not black and brown, their friends are not black and brown, and their work colleagues are not black and brown. So for them, they are not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not identified, but connected. They're not connected to the realities of people whose social space they do not share. So the fact of the matter is, if many of them are going into these jobs, etc., claiming that they're there for public services because so-called BAME communities are part of the public. And if priority is only given to people that look like them or reflect their type of appearance, then they're doing an injustice and a disservice to the wider community, because the community is very, very wide. It has an idiosyncratic nature, which means there's particularities and specificities as far as needs are concerned. And we have to move, I believe, from this concept of equality to equity. Everyone has specific needs, so you cannot treat everyone the same. And that, and there's a lot of money within these services which need to be spent more wisely in order to accommodate every person. And sometimes we're shot down in a sense when we try to complain and say, well, this needs to be done or that needs to be done. It's like, for instance, I have a disability, even though it's not a physical disability with a walking stick. I do have trouble walking, sitting still. I have back problems, I got arthritis, etc. And one of the things which is very common if I catch public transportation, such as a bus, is that bus drivers won't even wait for me to sit down. Even though I got a disability pass, etc., they won't let me sit down, But I notice with other people who's got a disability pass and things, they will make those concessions for. So with public services is concerned, where public services is concerned, with me as an individual, I seem to feel that I'm an invisible entity using those services, which I'm paying out from my own hard-earned cash or money. And I think that is totally unfair. And there's probably hundreds upon thousands upon millions of people who are going through similar experiences. And that should be taken into account when we're looking at the strategic positions many of those middle class people are in. They should be held accountable, like I said, and that needs to filter down. And they need to make radical changes and stop talking the same nonsense or foolishness that they've been talking since the post-war era, because that is what is happening, unfortunately. There's some changes here and there, but not enough to impact. And where representation is concerned, we seem to be overrepresented in a lot of negative stuff and underrepresented when it comes to positive aspects of what we do in society, such as contribution, achievement, and accomplishments.
Yeah, really well said there. And I think I agree with everything. I agree with everything you said there, on the sense that, it is I always take the position, it is a duty upon myself and people like you to educate people. Obviously we need to be paid and valued. That's another discussion for another day. Always bring up being paid and valued for your work.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is a duty upon us to educate. I just don't know if there's a limit on that. Maybe that's, again, another discussion for another day. How many do we need to keep educating for people to keep making the same mistakes if they're not learning? Or do we need to try a different approach? Again, is that our burden to take on or not? But I think a really important point for us to discuss here is any positive steps public services have taken, or any positive examples I've encountered and you've encountered. I think for me, my example would be I had a meeting with a minister at Welsh Government, and going through security was really interesting. I wasn't really too pleased by the way I was treated. I then obviously raised the concern, and it was acknowledged and listened to, and it was the security team that I had an issue with. And when I raised the concern, I asked the question and said, actually, I want to see if there's an opportunity to give training to these members of staff. And that opportunity was taken with open arms, and I offered the training, and it was a really positive conversation that we've had with the staff, and really open dialogue in a safe space for the security. They said it was an amazing opportunity to actually ask questions to someone who was of Muslim faith and who was dressed a certain way, and so much learning had taken place. And from that, then I built a relationship with Welsh Government, which then they've invited me obviously to be part of the Wales Race Forum. And I think it really did change my mind on the way Welsh Government was working for the public, and how they because I had a totally really pessimistic view, but I was much more optimistic because they actually listened and said, you know, why don't you be part of this? And I got invited, and it really opened up so many other doors for me to be part of conversations with the Department for Transportation or economics, and really doors have opened that I never thought would actually open. So this whole thing about actually creating the Race Equality Action Plan, and it's not just the Welsh Government talking again. For me, that's definitely been a really positive example, and it's just really snowballed from there. And, you know, that example can be actually followed, and you know, other approaches, similar organizations can use the same example and really and truly listen to grassroots people, because I'm on these meetings now with with ministers and lots of other really powerful people, but you know, my lived experiences is just as powerful. So I think it's really important that I'm on at that table. Have there been any positive experiences for yourself, Abu-Bakr, and any public institutions or public services that have really done the right thing and are continuing to do that?
And I think if you look at like bus services, for instance, you know, they got the hydraulic buses which can go down. So it helps people like myself who've got arthritis get up on the bus, you know, much easier, etc. You know, where you got disability spaces, etc. There's more leg room for myself because I'm a tall person and my knees is not touching, you know, the seat in front. Access for wheelchairs, you know, has certainly increased, you know, especially since 1995, you know, access into buildings, you know, accessibility onto the bus, coming off the bus, you know, drivers helping people get on. So there has been some major positive changes, but all those changes have come by people protesting and requesting change. It hasn't come from the top by them sitting there making those decisions. People have prompted those decisions to be made in order to make those particular changes. You know, even if I look at other public services such as education, because this is really important as well, you know, which from the womb to the tomb. And if we're looking at educational institutions, the government now, as an example, as far as public services is concerned, is now prepared to discuss and talk about trying to diversify the curriculum in order to reflect those groups of people within their nation, you know, in order to allow other groups, the dominant culture, to learn about them. So it's not on-job training in school. They learn about it in the curriculum. They can reflect, especially in areas where they don't have these so-called minority ethnic communities. So, you know, there has been some, you know, real positive changes, discussions, etc. But what is important is that those things go through applying it, you know, and to maintain it. And a lot of things is that we need to move, a lot of the companies, you know, and organizations that deal with public services need to move away from this mindset of tick box exercise. We have to come away from this now. You can't be using people to get extra funding and the money is not being spent specifically on them. You're using people that you don't like or you don't trust or whatever the case may be to enrich yourselves to maintain your mortgages or your holidays so many times a year in these same people's country, you know, whatever the case may be. So there has been some positive changes and we have to acknowledge that, you know, and it is difficult sometimes because you can't please all the people all the time. But the reality is when we're trying to reflect of us people who are taxpayers and who are public service users, if we're paying that money, we expect a first-class service. If you're charging a certain amount, we expect a service. Even if you go into buildings, say, for instance, you find sometimes you go to the reception, that can be a off-putting experience. You know, you're going in there and the person, you know, in the reception, the foyer area, they're speaking to you like not, they actually go on like nightclub bouncers to a large extent. You know, you've been humiliated, they're speaking to you loud and all these other type of things. So it needs to be, so they need training as well in order to accommodate, you know, people got language problems, etc. They haven't got the patience, they're not employing people to help with translation, and they're in strategic communities where there's a massive amount of Black and brown people. So provide these services. Provide these services.
I think that's a really good point to sort of wrap up on, and in this whole thing about, you know, if we're paying our taxes, then we expect really, like you said, first class services for what we're paying for, and this whole notion that we as people of color don't expect anything extra. It's just that, you know, it should be part of the approach in the first place, and not this whole thing about you need special measures or you need something different, or it's going to be really difficult to do this. But yeah, I think that's a really important point to sort of end on, and for public services to really continue these conversations with communities of colour, and to maintain and sustain their approaches rather than have a tick box approach. I think we'll wrap up there. But yeah, thank you so much, Abu-Bakr, for a really interesting conversation, and to the listeners, I hope you guys have enjoyed that. Thank you so much for listening.